I've always liked the solitude of the open road. My name is Jake, and I've been a truck driver for over 15 years. Back then, I was hauling a load of appliances to a small town in Texas. It was early June, the heat was relentless, and I'd spent the whole day driving under a punishing sun. I pulled into a rest stop near the Texas-Mexico border, planning to spend the night there before continuing my journey in the morning. The place was nothing fancy. A few truck parking spots, a rundown restroom, and an old vending machine that only took coins. It wasn't exactly comfortable, but for us truckers, any safe spot to park becomes a temporary home. After parking my truck, I went through my usual routine, checked the locks on the doors, organized my things, and made myself a sandwich while listening to a barely audible local radio station. The sky was clear, and the only sounds were the occasional car tires on the highway and the hum of insects. Around 11 p.m., I was getting ready to settle in for the night when I noticed something strange. A black van had pulled into the spot next to mine, and two men were unloading something. At first, I didn't think much of it, but there was something about the way they moved, hurried and discreet, that caught my attention. I tried to convince myself it wasn't my business. Maybe they were just transferring cargo, something perfectly normal for people on the road. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. One of the men was carrying what looked like a person, arms and legs bound, mouth covered with duct tape. The person struggled weakly, as if trying to fight back but too exhausted to do much. I blinked, thinking I must have been mistaken. But when I saw the other man carrying another bound person, the horrifying truth hit me like a ton of bricks. My heart raced. I knew this was serious, and every instinct in my body screamed for me to do something. I grabbed my phone, but I froze. Call the police? What if these guys saw me? My truck was parked just a few feet away, and I had no idea if they were armed. At the same time, the thought of those people being taken to some terrible fate made me feel sick. As my mind wrestled with whether to call the authorities or stay quiet, I noticed one of the men looking in the direction of my truck. I froze. He stood there, motionless, staring directly at my truck. It was hard to make out his features in the dark, but I could feel the weight of his gaze, like he knew I was there, watching. I tried not to move, keeping my breathing as quiet as possible. My mind raced in a million directions. Had he seen my reflection in the window? Did he suspect I was watching them? Meanwhile, the other man kept transferring the bound people into a white sedan parked nearby. The tension in the air was suffocating, and I could feel sweat dripping down my back, even with the cool night air seeping through the cracked window. The man took a step toward my truck, and my heart pounded so hard I thought it might give me away. Instinctively, I ducked down behind the dashboard, trying to stay out of sight. My phone was still in my hand, but I couldn't bring myself to dial or call the police. The sound of the ring or the dispatcher's voice could expose me. My mind scrambled for a solution as I listened to slow, deliberate footsteps approaching. Each step sounded louder than the last, like he wanted me to know he was coming. Then, the noise stopped. I waited for what felt like hours, even though it was probably only seconds, before I dared to peek out the window again. He wasn't there anymore. My heart was still racing, but for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of relief that was quickly replaced by a new wave of terror. The man had moved to the other side of my truck, near the passenger door, and was scanning the cab carefully. At that moment, I realized that if he spotted even the slightest movement, I'd be in serious trouble. I didn't know if he had a weapon, but the way he carried himself suggested someone used to handling dangerous situations. What happened next was pure instinct. I grabbed the thermos sitting on the console and, as quietly as I could, pushed it to the floor on the driver's side, creating a faint metallic clink on the rubber mat. The man seemed to hear it and turned his attention to the other side of the truck. As he moved to investigate the noise, I used the opportunity to slip into the back of the cab and hide behind the curtains of my sleeping area. My eyes were wide, my breathing shallow, and the tension was unbearable. All I could do was hope he'd lose interest and return to the van. I stayed there, curled up behind the curtains, trying to control the sound of my breathing. My heart was pounding so loudly that I was convinced he could hear it. I kept hoping the man would give up and leave, but the silence that hung in the air was even more unsettling. Every second felt like an eternity. Suddenly, I heard footsteps again, this time quicker. He was heading back to the sedan, and through a gap in the curtain, I saw the other man talking to him, seemingly annoyed. Maybe they were arguing about how long they were taking or the risk of being spotted. The tension was still suffocating, but they finally seemed to be wrapping up. They loaded the last bound people into the trunk and the back seat of the car. That's when I realized the black van was now completely empty, and they were getting ready to leave. I tried to convince myself the danger was over, but something told me they wouldn't just ignore the possibility that someone had been watching. Before getting into the sedan, the two men stopped and scanned the area one last time. I shrank back even more, silently praying not to be noticed. When the car finally pulled away and disappeared down the highway, my mind was a storm of emotions: relief, terror, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. I waited what felt like hours, just to be sure they weren't coming back. When I finally felt safe enough to move, I realized I was shaking from head to toe. I picked up my phone, and this time, I called the police. The voice on the other end was calm and professional, but I could barely get my words out. I gave them the exact location of the rest stop and described the van and the sedan as best as I could, including the partial license plate numbers I had managed to catch. The dispatcher told me to stay where I was and wait for a patrol car. The next few minutes were agonizing. Even though the men were gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Every sound, every shadow seemed more threatening than before. When the flashing lights of a patrol car finally lit up the parking lot, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Two officers got out and started asking questions. They seemed to take the case seriously, but what stuck with me the most was the look of concern on their faces when I described the bound people and the two men. Something told me this wasn't the first time they'd heard about something like this. After answering the officers' questions, they asked me to wait while they searched the area. I sat in the patrol car, watching their flashlights sweep over every corner of the rest stop. They wrote down the details of the van and sedan and radioed other units in the area, trying to track the suspects. Meanwhile, one of the officers tried to reassure me, but I knew that sense of safety was only temporary. The image of those bound people being taken against their will was burned into my mind, like a nightmare I couldn't shake. The officers eventually came back and told me they hadn't found anything at the scene. That wasn't surprising, but their tone suggested the situation was more complicated than I'd realized. They said they would forward the case to the Human Trafficking Division and that I might be called to give a more detailed statement if needed. Before leaving, they advised me not to stay at the rest stop overnight and to find a more crowded, well-lit area to park. I followed their advice, but as I drove down the empty highway, I couldn't stop checking my mirrors, half expecting the sedan's headlights to reappear behind me. For weeks, I anxiously waited for updates. I called the local precinct twice, but they couldn't give me much information. All they said was that the investigation was ongoing and that similar reports had come in from other rest stops near the border. That only made my unease grow. This wasn't an isolated crime. It seemed like part of something much larger and darker. I never found out what happened to those people, or if the men were caught. All that remained was the memory of that night and the guilt of not being able to do more, even though I knew it would have put me in danger. To this day, I avoid driving near the border at night. That experience changed the way I see safety on the road, something I had always valued. I can't pass by a rest stop without remembering what I saw, and I often wonder how many other horrifying things happen in the shadows, unnoticed. Sharing this here might be my way of processing what happened. If you're reading this and work on the road like I do, stay alert. There are things you can't ignore, even when fear tells you to look away. I've never been the type to believe in ghost stories or urban legends. I've spent most of my life driving trucks across the country, so I've heard it all. Creatures appearing at night, people vanishing at rest stops, things like that. I always thought they were just stories to scare rookies. I was practical, down to earth. At least I was until that night in the summer of 2015. I had just delivered a heavy load in Texas and was on my way back to Alabama. It was late, around 2 in the morning, and the drowsiness was hitting hard. I decided to pull into one of those rest stops in the middle of nowhere, where the only light comes from a few flickering street lamps. I planned to nap for about 30 minutes before hitting the road again. When I woke up, something felt off. You know that gut feeling, like someone's watching you? At first, I thought it was just paranoia from being alone in the dark, but then I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye. I glanced at the passenger seat and nearly jumped out of my skin. There was a woman sitting there. It didn't make any sense. I always locked the cab before sleeping. She looked young, maybe in her early 20s, with messy blonde hair falling over her shoulders. She wore an oversized white t-shirt and jeans, but what really caught my attention was her expression, wide-eyed and desperate. Before I could say anything, she raised her hands as if to calm me down. "Please, don't scream. I need help," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. My mind was racing. How had she gotten in? Why did she look so terrified? She noticed my confusion and started speaking quickly. "I was running. He's after me. Please just drive, now." I didn't know what to do. The logical part of me wanted to kick her out and move on with my life. But something about the way she was shaking, constantly glancing out the window, made me hesitate. "Who's after you?" I asked, trying to sound calm, though my voice shook. She shook her head, her eyes welling up with tears. "We don't have time. He's going to catch us if we don't leave." Against my better judgment, I started the truck and drove off, my head full of questions and my heart pounding. The silence in the truck was heavy as I drove down the empty highway. She wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were glued to the side mirror, as if expecting to see someone following us. I tried to get her to talk, to understand what was happening. "Who is this guy? Do you know him?" I asked. She took a long time to answer, finally murmuring, "He's not normal." That didn't help calm my nerves. "What do you mean? Is he dangerous?" She just nodded, still staring out into the darkness. I kept telling myself I was doing the right thing, but a part of me was already regretting letting her in. As the minutes passed, I started noticing strange things. She was restless, constantly shifting in her seat, clutching her hands tightly in her lap. Every time I tried to ask more questions, she either changed the subject or fell silent, staring at the road. The air in the cab felt heavy, loaded with tension, like something was about to happen. I started feeling uneasy, as if I was being manipulated, but the thought of leaving her stranded in the middle of nowhere seemed cruel. "Look, if you're scared, we can head to a police station," I suggested, trying to sound rational. She turned to me so fast, it nearly startled me. "No, no police. They won't believe me," she said, almost shouting. Her wide-eyed look returned, and there was something in her tone that didn't sit right with me. That's when I noticed a detail I hadn't picked up on before: her clothes. While she was clean, it looked like she had been thrown to the ground and trampled. There were dirt stains on the knees of her jeans and a small tear on the side of her t-shirt. But what really caught my attention was the smell. It wasn't exactly unpleasant, but it had a metallic tang to it, like rust or blood. When I asked what had happened, she dodged the question, saying she just needed to get somewhere safe. A chill ran down my spine. For the first time, I started to think that maybe she wasn't who she seemed to be. After almost an hour of driving, she asked to stop at another rest area. "I need to use the bathroom," she said, her voice calmer now, but still tinged with urgency. I reluctantly pulled over, my suspicions growing stronger by the minute. As she stepped out, I watched her through the rearview mirror. She walked slowly, stopping every few steps to glance around, her behavior unnervingly cautious. Grabbing my phone, I searched for local news, hoping to find something about a missing woman or anything that might explain the situation. I found nothing. When she returned to the cab, something had changed. She seemed less anxious but still wary, as if she were plotting something. My body tensed as she sat back in the passenger seat. "You okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded, but didn't speak. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake letting her back in. As I resumed driving, my focus wasn't on the road anymore. I kept glancing at her from the corner of my eye, waiting for the moment when the truth, whatever it was, would finally reveal itself. The road felt darker than usual, as if the streetlights had decided to abandon us. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the hum of the engine and the tires on the asphalt. The longer I drove, the heavier her presence felt. She started murmuring something under her breath, so low it was almost inaudible. "What did you say?" I asked, trying to ignore the knot tightening in my stomach. She turned to look at me with those tired, wide eyes, but didn't answer. Instead, she turned her face back to the window. It was like she was talking to herself, or to something else. I began asking more direct questions. "Where exactly did you come from? Who's the person chasing you?" She let out a deep sigh, as if exhausted from running, and finally answered, "I was at home. He just showed up. I don't know how he found me." That didn't make any sense. "He? Who is he? An ex-boyfriend? A stranger? What?" She hesitated for a long time before finally saying something that made my remaining shred of rationality start to crumble. "He's not human." I let out a nervous laugh, thinking she was joking, but when I looked at her, there wasn't a hint of humor on her face. Her expression was pale, like all the blood had drained from it. As I tried to process what she'd just said, something unexpected happened. The radio, which had been off since I left the first rest stop, suddenly came to life, emitting static. A low, uneven noise filled the cab, growing louder and louder. I reached to turn it down, but the volume shot up on its own, almost deafening. She screamed, "It's him! He's here!" I slammed on the brakes instinctively, and the truck skidded slightly before coming to a stop. The sound cut off as abruptly as it had started. "What the hell is going on?" I asked, my voice shaking. She was clutching the seat, her eyes wide, staring into the darkness outside as if expecting something to emerge. The fear was consuming me. As absurd as her story sounded, something was undeniably wrong. I decided I had to know the truth. I grabbed a flashlight from the compartment and stepped out of the truck to check the surroundings. The night was cold, and the wind whispered through the trees lining the side of the road. As I walked around the truck, I noticed tracks on the ground, footprints, but they were far too large to belong to any human. My breathing grew heavier, and my mind scrambled for logical explanations. Maybe it was an animal, maybe shadows playing tricks. But then I heard a sound coming from inside the cab. It wasn't her screaming or speaking. It was laughter. Low, raspy laughter. That laughter froze me in place. It wasn't human. It was deep, reverberating in a way that seemed impossible for such a small space. I swallowed hard and climbed back into the truck, clutching the flashlight like some makeshift weapon. She was sitting in the passenger seat, curled up, but something about her felt wrong. Her expression had changed. The terrified look she'd had before was now vacant, almost as if she were in a trance. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. Instead, she slowly turned her head toward me, and in that moment, I swear I saw a reflection in her eyes that wasn't natural. It was as if something else was looking back at me through her. Fear gripped me. "Who are you? What's happening?" I shouted, trying to maintain control of the situation. She smiled, not a friendly smile, but something twisted, making the air feel heavier. "I told you he was coming," she murmured, but her voice no longer sounded like hers. It was deeper, almost masculine, with a tone that sent chills down my spine. I didn't know what was worse, the idea that something was out there or the growing suspicion that she was what I should be running from. My instincts screamed for me to get out of there, but something held me back. Maybe it was the fear that any wrong move would make things worse. Then the truck lights began to flicker. At first, I thought it was an electrical issue, but I quickly realized it wasn't mechanical. It felt like an invisible presence was toying with the circuits, trying to push me over the edge. The radio came back on, emitting static again, but this time, amidst the noise, I could hear a voice whispering disconnected words. Most of it was incomprehensible, but one phrase came through loud and clear. "She doesn't belong to you." My heart nearly stopped. I looked at her, and in that moment, I realized I was completely alone in this situation, with no one to help or confirm this was real. Suddenly she started convulsing in her seat, as if in pain, but there was something unsettling about it, almost like she was enjoying it. Her movements were jerky, unnatural. "What are you?" I asked, unable to stop the tremor in my voice. She stopped abruptly, as if my words had some power. "I'm not the problem," she said, her voice returning to its original tone, though something still felt off. "He's here, and you brought him." Before I could respond or even process what she meant, a deafening sound erupted from outside, like something massive was approaching. I couldn't see anything beyond the darkness, but I knew we were no longer alone. That sound shook the ground, the truck, and even my bones. It was impossible to tell what was approaching, but I knew it wasn't anything normal. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, fighting the urge to abandon everything and run. "If he's here, what do I do? How do I make this stop?" I shouted, almost begging. She leaned closer to me, her eyes once again glowing with that unnatural light. "You can't do anything. He's already seen you." Her words felt like a punch to the gut. All I wanted to do was turn around and leave her behind, but deep down, I knew there was no escaping this. Suddenly the cab shook violently. The impact was so strong it nearly threw me against the steering wheel. The sound of metal screeching filled the air, and I realized something was scraping the side of the truck. It was like giant claws trying to tear the door off. I screamed and tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't respond. I turned the key frantically, hearing nothing but a dry click. "It's too late," she said, now disturbingly calm. "He wants me, but you brought him here." Before I could understand what she meant, she opened the door and stepped out. She didn't run or hesitate, just walked straight toward the sound coming from the darkness. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, but I was paralyzed. I watched as she disappeared into the shadows, and then the noise stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. It was so quiet I could hear my own breathing, ragged and uneven. A few seconds later, the truck's engine roared to life on its own, as if nothing had happened. I didn't wait to question it. I slammed the gear into drive and sped off as fast as the truck could go, not daring to look back. After miles of driving, I realized I was drenched in sweat, my hands shaking on the wheel. The radio was silent, the lights no longer flickered, and everything seemed normal again. Since that night, I've never stopped at isolated rest areas. I don't know what that thing was or what really happened to that girl. But sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night, I feel a chill run down my spine, like something or someone is still watching me. And the worst part? Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I think I see that same twisted smile reflected in the rearview mirror. I was never one to believe in trucker stories, you know? There's always someone swearing they've seen something bizarre out on the road, but in the end, it's usually just exhaustion or imagination. I was 37 at the time and had been driving trucks for almost a decade. It was a lonely job, but I enjoyed the freedom. That night, I was on my last stretch before unloading at a distribution center, and I decided to park under an overpass near the entrance. It was convenient, you know? There was a single flickering streetlight providing some light. It was cold, and I just wanted a few hours of sleep before getting back to work. My truck cab was my sanctuary. Simple, but comfortable enough for the grind. I woke up in the middle of the night to a faint sound, like something tapping on the passenger side window. My first thought was the wind. That area was dusty and full of odd noises at night. I turned over, grumbled something, and tried to go back to sleep, ignoring it. But you know that feeling, like something's not right? It was as if the silence between the sounds was heavy, different. I lay still for a few minutes, listening to the wind outside, feeling the unease grow. The sound didn't come back, so I forced my mind to switch off again. Maybe it was just my head playing tricks on me. I don't know how much time passed, but I woke up again, this time with my heart racing for no reason. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 3:27 a.m. That's when I saw something that froze me. Out of the corner of my eye, standing at the edge of the overpass, there was someone, just a silhouette. I couldn't make out the details, just the outline of a person, as if they were staring straight at me. The streetlight flickered, casting a faint glow on the figure, and I swear my spine locked up. They were tall, skinny, and seemed to be looking directly at me. Before I could react, the light went out again, and when it came back on, the figure was gone. I sat there, motionless, staring at the empty spot where the figure had been. My mind was scrambling for a rational explanation. Maybe it was a homeless person, or someone curious about the parked truck, but there was something about it that didn't feel right. I couldn't move for several minutes, listening only to the sound of my own heartbeat. I glanced out the passenger side window, but all I saw was darkness. I decided to leave the engine running, as if the sound might keep me awake and chase off the unease. The night dragged on slowly. I kept dozing off and waking up, always with the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I opened my eyes, I checked the mirrors and windows, but never saw anything. When the sky finally began to lighten, I felt a wave of relief. Maybe it was all in my head, or perhaps just the exhaustion from the job. The first ray of sunlight broke through the cab window, and for a moment, I felt foolish for letting it bother me so much. I decided to step out of the truck to stretch my legs before heading to the distribution center. That's when I saw the marks. On the side of the truck, near the driver's door, there were a series of handprints on the body of the vehicle. They were muddy, climbing from the ground all the way up to the window. My heart started racing. I knew those weren't there when I parked the night before. The prints looked too large, with fingers that seemed oddly long, almost unnatural. They weren't very clear, but the dried mud made the outlines stand out. I followed the trail with my eyes all the way up to the window where I had heard that tapping noise during the night. A shiver ran down my spine. While inspecting the door, I noticed something even more unsettling. There were scratches around the lock. They weren't deep, but they were unmistakable, as if someone had tried to force their way in during the night. I ran my fingers over the grooves, feeling the rough edges, trying to figure out what could have caused them. I thought about calling the police, but what was I going to say? That someone had left muddy prints on my truck and scratched the lock? Who would take that seriously? I decided to take a few photos with my phone, just in case. Maybe it was just a prank, but something didn't add up. The strangest part was the lack of footprints around the truck. The area was hard-packed dirt, and anyone walking there would have left tracks in the wet ground from the rain the night before. But the only marks were the handprints climbing directly up to the door. I stood there, staring at the ground, trying to find some logical explanation. Could someone have climbed down from the overpass directly onto my truck? Or maybe... No, I didn't want to finish that thought. I knew I needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. I climbed back into the cab, started the engine, and let my eyes sweep the mirrors one last time. As I drove to the distribution center, my mind wouldn't stop racing. I kept trying to piece things together, but every theory sounded more absurd than the last. Why would someone try to get into my truck? And how did those handprints get there without any footprints on the ground? The truck radio was on, but I barely registered the music in the background. The scenery around me, empty roads and a gray morning sky, only made everything feel more surreal. When I arrived at the destination, I parked and went into the office to check in. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the unease. It was like I had brought something from that night with me. After unloading the cargo, I decided to look at the photos I had taken. While zooming in on the images on my phone, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. One of the handprints looked different. The fingers were long, yes, but there was something else. In the mud, there were tiny grooves, almost like the marks of ridiculously long nails or claws. My stomach churned. There was no way those were made by an ordinary person. I stared at the screen, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but the more I looked, the more unsettled I felt. I deleted the photos, thinking it might be better to forget what I saw. On my way back, I decided not to take that shortcut again. I avoided passing under the same overpass, as if something there might draw me back into that oppressive feeling. Even so, the uneasiness lingered. The following night, despite parking in a completely different location, I couldn't relax. Every noise outside made my heart race, and the memory of the figure on the overpass haunted me. I felt like I was being watched, even when I was completely alone. It was hard to explain, but the sensation was almost physical, like the air around me was heavier. The next few days were similar. I kept working, but the experience had left a mark on me. I started noticing small scratches on the truck that hadn't been there before. Maybe it was just paranoia, but they always seemed to appear after a night parked in some isolated spot. Each time I checked the truck's body, my mind flashed back to that night under the overpass. It felt like the experience wasn't over, as if something was still with me, following me to every stop I made. On the third night, when I went to sleep, I found myself locking the cab from the inside and wedging something heavy against the door, something I'd never done before. On the fourth night, something happened that made me take drastic action. I parked at a busy gas station, trying to avoid isolated areas. The constant flow of people and the sound of engines should have brought some relief, but it didn't. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly with that same oppressive feeling. I looked out the window and saw everything seemed normal, cars passing by, lights shining. But when I glanced at the rearview mirror, my heart froze. There, at the edge of the parking lot, stood a figure. Tall and motionless, it was watching me. I didn't need much time to recognize it. It was the same silhouette from the first night under the overpass. I was completely paralyzed. Whatever it was there, staring at me, as if it knew exactly where I was. My breathing grew shallow, and for a moment, I thought about getting out of the cab to confront it, whatever it was. But a part of me knew that wasn't a good idea. I blinked, and the figure was gone, just like before. It was as if it had never been there, but the weight of its presence still hung in the air. By that point, I knew I wasn't dealing with something normal. It wasn't fatigue or my imagination. It was real. The next morning, when I checked the truck, the muddy handprints were back. This time, they didn't just go up to the window. They extended to the back of the truck, as if something had climbed up and inspected the cargo. That was the breaking point for me. I decided I couldn't do this anymore. I called my boss and requested a transfer to an urban route. I made up some excuse about not feeling comfortable on nighttime, isolated routes anymore, and thankfully, he agreed without asking too many questions. It was a relief to know I wouldn't have to spend another night alone on empty roads. To this day, I don't know what happened or what that thing was. I've never had another experience like it, but honestly, I don't want answers. Just thinking about the muddy handprints and that figure on the overpass makes my stomach churn. Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if I had stepped out of the cab that first night. But truthfully, I'd rather not know. If there's one thing I've learned from this, it's that some questions are better left unanswered. I never thought a routine job could put me in a situation straight out of a suspense movie. My name is Mark. I'm 34, and I've been a truck driver for almost a decade. It all happened last year on a quiet Thursday night. I was hauling a shipment of appliances from Chicago to Indianapolis. It was one of those peaceful night drives, no traffic, just the hum of the engine and the dark highway stretching ahead. My truck, an old but reliable Freightliner, had clocked countless miles without issues. I was the kind of guy who followed all the rules and made sure to double-check every load before hitting the road. That night, though, something felt off. Everything was fine until I started hearing a strange noise coming from the trailer. It wasn't constant, more like an irregular thumping or scraping sound. I figured maybe one of the appliances had come loose and decided it'd be better to pull over and check before anything got damaged. The highway was deserted, the darkness broken only by the occasional street lamp. I found a shoulder to pull over, slowed the truck, and parked. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out, the cold night wind biting at my skin. That uneasy feeling was growing in my chest, but I brushed it off, blaming fatigue. I opened the trailer door and shone my flashlight inside. The cargo looked intact, exactly as I'd loaded it. But the noise persisted, coming from somewhere near the back. That's when I noticed a strange metal wall at the far end of the trailer. It shouldn't have been there. I'd helped load this shipment and knew the layout by heart. I cautiously moved closer, the noise getting clearer with every step. When I touched the metal wall, I realized it was loose. With some effort, I managed to pry open a hidden panel. What I saw left me speechless. A man curled up inside, his face pale, his clothes dirty, and a gash on his arm. He looked terrified, like I was a threat to him. Before I could say anything, I heard the sound of tires crunching on the asphalt behind me. A black SUV had pulled up, stopping just behind my truck. Two men stepped out, their silhouettes sharp in the dim light. They wore dark suits and had an air of menace that made my stomach twist. One of them, a tall, bald man, fixed his gaze on me. "What did you see here?" he asked, his voice cold and sharp. My adrenaline spiked, and I tried to mask my fear. "Nothing, just checking my load," I stammered, trying to sound casual, but my voice betrayed me. The other man, younger, with slicked back hair and dark glasses despite the night, took a step toward the trailer, and I knew something was very, very wrong. As they got closer, my heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. The injured man inside the compartment started whispering something, but he was so weak I couldn't make it out. He trembled, looking like he was on the edge of collapse. I instinctively stepped in front of the panel to try and hide it, but I knew they had already noticed something. The bald man narrowed his eyes at me, his stare cutting through my nerves. "Step aside," he ordered, his voice like a blade. My palms were sweating as I tried to come up with an excuse, anything to buy time. "It's just a loose wall," I said, pointing to the panel. "Nothing serious, must be part of the truck." The younger man, with his cold, calculated demeanor, gave a thin, humorless smile. He brushed past me, nudging my shoulder, and started inspecting the opening. That's when things got even more intense. The injured man tried to speak again, but only managed a desperate whisper, "Please, help," before losing consciousness. I knew I had to do something, but I was frozen in place. My survival instincts were screaming at me to stay quiet, but my conscience told me I couldn't just let this happen. The bald man stepped forward, his expression sinister, as he looked me up and down. "Looks like you've seen more than you should," he said casually, though his tone carried a chilling undertone. I tried to argue, saying I was just doing my job and didn't know anything, but it was clear they didn't believe me. The tension in the air was suffocating, like a storm about to break. The younger man pulled out a phone and started dialing, then turned to the bald man and said something like, "We need backup. He's seen enough." At that moment, the only thought in my mind was, I need to get out of here. My legs felt like lead, but I knew if I didn't act, I might not get another chance. I glanced at the truck, calculating the distance. Their SUV was partially blocking my way, but I figured I could swerve around it. The bald man started saying something to the younger guy, but I didn't catch it. My body moved on instinct. I took a step back and in one swift motion slammed the trailer door shut. The sound echoed into the still night, catching them off guard for a split second. I used that moment to sprint to the truck's cabin. My hands were shaking as I fumbled to open the cabin door. Every second felt like an eternity, and I could hear the hurried footsteps of the two men closing in behind me. When I finally managed to get the door open and climb in, I turned the key in the ignition so hard I almost snapped it. The engine hesitated for a moment, like it was mocking my desperation, but then it roared to life. I threw the truck into gear and slammed my foot on the accelerator. Their SUV was still partially blocking the road, but I didn't have time to hesitate. I turned the wheel hard and scraped past the barrier, the sound of metal on metal echoing in my ears. As I picked up speed, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the two men running back to their vehicle. The bald man was shouting something, though I couldn't make out the words. The SUV's engine growled as they gave chase, their headlights flashing furiously. My trailer swayed dangerously behind me, but I couldn't afford to slow down. My mind was racing as fast as the truck, flooded with fear and confusion. Who was the man in the compartment? Why was he there? And who were these guys chasing me? Every instinct told me I was in over my head, but all I could do was keep driving. I thought about stopping at a police station, but we were in the middle of nowhere, with no signs of civilization in sight. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no signal. Figures, just when I needed it most. The SUV was closing the gap, their high beams blinding me intermittently. They were trying to intimidate me, but I knew that stopping wasn't an option. My heart pounded in sync with the engine's roar, and then I remembered a dirt road turnoff a few miles ahead. I'd passed it before on a previous route and knew it led to a rarely used back road. When I saw the turnoff sign, I yanked the wheel hard, almost losing control as the truck skidded onto the loose gravel. The tires kicked up a cloud of dust, briefly obscuring their view. I held my breath as I navigated the bumpy path, hoping the dust would buy me some time. The SUV followed a few seconds later, but I'd gained a small lead. I knew I couldn't keep running forever. The truck was too slow for this kind of pursuit. I needed a plan, fast. Then an idea struck me. If I could find a spot to hide the truck, I might be able to throw them off my trail. But first, I had to check on the injured man in the trailer and make sure he was still alive. I drove for a few more minutes along the dirt road, scanning desperately for somewhere to hide. The SUV stayed on my trail, but the dust cloud I was kicking up seemed to slow them down. Finally, I spotted what looked like an old abandoned warehouse. The gates were slightly open, and there were no lights or signs of life around. I made a sharp turn into the lot, turned off my headlights, and parked the truck behind a pile of large debris big enough to hide the trailer. I killed the engine and sat there, holding my breath, straining to hear any sound of pursuit. The SUV's headlights swept past the entrance but didn't stop. My chest heaved with relief as they continued down the dirt road. I waited a few more minutes to make sure they weren't doubling back, then climbed out of the truck and headed for the trailer. When I opened the door, the man was still inside, unconscious. His arm wound looked worse, and his face was alarmingly pale. I realized I needed to get him to a hospital, but I wasn't sure it was safe to return to the main road. Everything about this situation screamed danger, and I knew those men wouldn't just give up. As I was thinking about what to do next, the man stirred and opened his eyes for a moment. They can't find me," he whispered, his voice weak and desperate. "Please, don't let them." I didn't know who he was or why he was in my trailer, but something about him made me believe he was more of a victim than anything else. I pulled out my phone and this time managed to get a weak signal. I called 911 and gave them a rough idea of where I was, leaving out any mention of the men or the hidden compartment. I just said I'd found an injured man and needed help. Not long after, I heard the distant sound of an ambulance approaching. The SUV never returned, and the paramedics arrived to take the man away. He was too weak to explain anything, and I never got the chance to ask. I considered telling the police everything, but something about the way those men had looked at me made me think twice. Whatever this was, it was bigger than me, and I didn't want to get caught up in it. To this day, I still think about that night. I never found out who that man was or why he was hidden in my trailer, but one thing's for sure: I never want to go through anything like that again. I've always been a simple guy, you know? I've been working as a truck driver for almost 15 years, and while life on the road can get lonely, I enjoy the freedom it gives me. This story happened in the fall of 2018, when I was hauling a load of automotive parts from a warehouse in Denver to a distribution center in Salt Lake City. It was a clear night, not a cloud in the sky, but that biting cold that only someone who's driven on a deserted highway in the dead of night can understand. I was cruising along the I-70, sipping lukewarm coffee from my cup holder, with a classic rock playlist playing softly on the radio, when I suddenly ran into an unexpected road closure. The detour signs directed me onto a smaller highway I'd never used before. This highway was unlike any other I'd driven on. There was barely any lighting, and the few streetlights that existed seemed to be half working. The trees leaned over the road, forming a natural tunnel that made my truck's headlights feel weaker. The road signs were scarce, almost as if this stretch of road wasn't meant for regular use. It wasn't uncommon to take detours through unfamiliar areas, so I tried not to overthink it, but something about this particular stretch didn't feel right. Maybe it was the deafening silence. There wasn't a sound of other engines, not even the buzz of insects or rustling animals. Just the steady hum of my truck's engine, echoing in a way that made everything feel more unsettling. After about 20 minutes of driving down this deserted highway, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. A car, maybe a dark sedan, had appeared out of nowhere and was following me. It kept a consistent distance, not too close, not too far, just enough that I could barely make out its headlights. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was another driver trying to find their way, just like me. But what unsettled me was that, even when I slowed down for some tighter curves, the car did the same. It was like it was mimicking my every move, never attempting to pass or fall behind. When I passed a lone gas station, I decided to pull over to refuel and shake off the growing tension building in my chest. The station looked like something out of an old movie, with one of those manual gas pumps and a flickering light over the convenience store entrance. There wasn't a soul around, but it seemed better than staying on the road with that car behind me. As I parked the truck by the pump, the sedan's headlights appeared in my mirror again. It stopped at the station's entrance, just far enough to watch me, and my heart started racing. Something about this felt wrong, and I knew I needed to stay on high alert. As I stepped out of the truck, the silence felt heavier, almost tangible. The only sound was the creak of the gas pump as I adjusted the nozzle into the tank. I tried to act natural, but my eyes kept darting to the sedan. It stayed parked there for a while, like the driver was deciding what to do. After a few seconds, the car door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket that looked a size too big for him. The way he moved was odd, almost clumsy, like someone who wasn't used to walking. As he started heading toward me, a chill ran down my spine. "Hey there, buddy. I'm kind of lost," he said, forcing a smile that didn't feel genuine. His teeth were slightly yellowed, and his voice had this slow, deliberate tone, like he was trying to sound casual but couldn't quite hide the nervousness. "Does this road get me back to the I-70? I think I missed my turn somewhere." As he spoke, something about the way his eyes studied me made me deeply uneasy. They weren't curious or confused, like you'd expect from someone who was lost. Instead, it felt like he was sizing me up, analyzing every move I made. My gut screamed at me to leave, but I knew I couldn't show fear. I forced myself to stay calm. I pointed back toward the direction I had come from and told him the I-70 was about 30 minutes down the same road. He nodded slowly, but it didn't seem like he cared about my answer. Instead, he took a step closer and asked, "Are you traveling alone?" That question caught me off guard, and my stomach tightened into a knot. Why would someone I just met ask something like that? I faked a smile and gave a vague response, saying my coworker was sleeping in the truck. Of course, it was a lie, but at that moment, it felt like the safest thing to say. He glanced at the truck for a few seconds, like he was trying to see through the tinted windows. My heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The silence around us felt oppressive, like the whole world had stopped breathing. "Well, thanks for the help," he finally said, but his smile stayed odd, almost forced. He walked back to his car, but didn't get in right away. He just stood there by the door as if waiting for me to make a move. I decided I wasn't going to wait to find out what he wanted. I climbed back into my truck and locked the doors as quickly as I could. Whatever was going on, I didn't want to stick around to find out. As I turned the engine back on, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the man still standing there, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his oversized jacket. He didn't seem in any hurry to leave, which only made the whole situation feel worse. I decided to get out of there, even though the tank wasn't completely full yet. The gas pump made a sharp clicking noise as I pulled it out and hurried back into the truck. The sedan was still parked there, and I avoided looking directly at it as I maneuvered the truck back onto the road. As soon as I started driving again, I saw the sedan's headlights in my mirrors. It was following me again, and this time it felt like it was closer than before. My stomach churned with a mix of fear and adrenaline, but I tried to convince myself it might just be a coincidence. Maybe he really was lost and heading the same way. But deep down, I knew better. The way he'd acted at the gas station, the strange questions, none of it felt right. The farther I drove, the more the tension built. The highway seemed endless, and the shadowy trees lining the road looked even more menacing. After about 15 minutes, I spotted a sign for a rest area 2 miles ahead. It was one of those simple ones with a public restroom and a few parking spots. But anything felt safer than continuing on this road with that car behind me. I slowed down and pulled into the rest area, hoping the sedan would keep going. Instead, it slowed down too, and parked a couple of car lengths away from my truck. The dim light from the parking lot illuminated the sedan just enough for me to see its outline, but the windows remained pitch black. It was as if the driver deliberately kept everything inside hidden. I stayed in the truck for a few minutes, trying to figure out what to do. My phone had no signal, common for areas like this, but it made the situation feel even more desperate. I kept glancing at the sedan in my mirrors, waiting for some kind of movement. Finally, the driver's door opened again, and the man stepped out. He was holding something in his hand, but it was too dark and too far to tell what it was. My pulse skyrocketed, and I knew I had to make a quick decision, stay locked in the truck or take my chances driving away, hoping the open road wouldn't bring something worse.